Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. For those who don't know, here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, we're all about bringing science, adventure, exploration, and conservation to classrooms all across North America and hopefully beyond. My name is Joe Grabowski. I will be your host for today, and I'm very excited to be joined for the second time in 3 months with Elisa McCall. Elisa is a conservation biologist specializing in polar bears, based out of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, although today she's in Churchill, Manitoba, generally called the polar bear capital of the world. She's been studying polar bears for 7 years, largely focusing on the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation, which is one of the first to be showing the impacts of climate change. So she currently works for Polar Bears International, supporting research and directing conservation outreach programs. So Elisa, thank you so much for joining us. I know the technology wasn't cooperating at first, but it looks like we have you now.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk to everybody about polar bears.
Well, we're always excited to have you joining in, and polar bears are always very exciting for classrooms, and they're a pretty important species right now, especially with what's going on in our Arctic.
They're kind of like a canary in a coal mine, we say. So they're an early warning of what could happen if we let the Arctic continue to warm, but we want to make sure we keep polar bears around in the Arctic for forever.
All right, I agree with you on that one 100%. So we'd love to hear a little bit about who you are, what you do, and let's keep our fingers crossed that the screen share cooperates for us today.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I will see what I can do. And I'm so sorry, you guys. So usually when I'm up here in Churchill, Manitoba, every day, most of the days, I go out on what we call a Tundra Buggy. And I'll show you a picture of that soon. But we drive around bears and we get them on a camera. But today our Tundra Buggy had some issues. It is so cold up in Churchill right now. It's been very, very cold, a lot of wind. We've had blizzards and a lot of things aren't cooperating. So we just make work whatever we can. So I'll try to show you some cool stuff anyway. And it's a lot of fun being here at this time of year because we're in the polar bear migration. So I'm just going to try to screen share right now. Beautiful slides that have some great stuff. Hopefully that's working. Does that seem like it's working?
Yeah, I can see myself. I see your presentation popping up. Looks good so far.
Okay, cool. So like Joe said, I work for a group called Polar Bears International. So a lot of my job is to study polar bears and then talk to people about polar bears because they're such a cool animal and there's so many neat things about them. One of the neat things is, of course, where they live. So polar bears live on sea ice. Out of all the bear species, they are the bear that needs sea ice in the ocean to survive. So each of those different colored shapes that you see on your screen right now is a different polar bear population. Might live in Canada or the United States or say Mexico. Polar bears have their own kind of populations as well, but they overlap with different countries. So there are 19 polar bear populations across the world. And you can see that they're all in the north. And they all overlap with where seals live because polar bears need seals. And so I don't know if you see my cursor right now, but we are in, on the right-hand side of your screen, kind of low, there's almost a rectangle red box. And that's where I am in right now, that little red box. Churchill is part of the Western Hudson Bay polar bear population in Canada. And Canada has 2/3 of the world's polar bears. So we have a lot of polar bears here. And we are called the polar bear capital of the world because polar bears make their home around here at this time of year. As the sea ice in Hudson Bay is beginning to form because it's getting close to winter, Hudson Bay freezes over totally in the winter and melts totally in the summer. And when there's ice, the bears are out there. Bears are here. And so when they're waiting for the ice to come to the coast right now, because they're really hungry, they haven't eaten, and they need to get that food. So they need a lot of blubber and a lot of calories. So polar bears require a lot of food to keep going, more food than maybe some other bears even. And polar bears mostly just want to eat in fat. They don't want to eat as many berries and vegetables and roots that brown bears and black bears want to eat. They really depend on walking on that sea ice that they eat, use the sea ice too. So seals swim under the sea ice and then make breathing holes to come up to breathe. And polar bears can wait by a breathing hole really, and then dive into the hole when the seal comes up to breathe air. So that's pretty cool. And seals sometimes also rest on the sea ice, and polar bears can sneak up on a seal and maybe catch it right off the ice like that. So the big thing about polar bears is that they definitely need ice, and they need ice because it helps them catch seals, and they need so much food. The ways that we know what's going on with polar bears is by studying polar bears. And we can do that in a bunch of different ways. And one of the ways we can do that is by tracking them. And so in Western Hudson Bay, we have studied polar bear population of all the world. So we know these polar bears better than we know the other polar bears for sure. I'm here for a few decades now, and we've been measuring how long the polar bears are and how wide they are. So body sizes, we can take samples from their fur, and if we study their fur, we can analyze it just like your hair. I don't know if you know this, but if we took a piece of your hair, we could find out maybe it has a stress hormone that our hair keeps inside of it, so we can figure out what level of stress you're under. We can figure out what you're eating that shows up in your hair, and we can also get from hair, so we can find out who is who. And so these cubs, they're with their mom, but if we have some of their hair and their DNA, then we can maybe find out who their dad is, which can really help us better understand polar bear population. And on the mom polar bear in this picture, you might notice a collar, and a collar is one way that we can find the movements of polar bears. So able to put a GPS on a polar bear, just like you might have a GPS in your car. Maybe your parents have a GPS. We can track these polar bears, and we can find out exactly where they're moving and when they're moving. And this really understands the population, because polar bears don't want to be anywhere near people. They want to be a long ways away. They want to be out on sea ice. And when they are where they want to be, we can't see them. And we don't know what they need and what they're doing. So this is one way we can understand them a little bit better. And the better we understand an animal, the better we can them all. So one of the other cool things for doing to research, we can work with zoos to train polar bears to do some different things to help us, again, understand them better. So this bear was at the Oregon Zoo. He learned how to walk on a treadmill. And you might say, well, that's pretty goofy. Why does a polar bear need to walk on a treadmill? Well, what's happening as sea ice melts is that sea ice is moving a lot more, and polar bears are having to walk a lot more to get there or less. And we want to know how much that is going to affect. So you guys might know that when you exercise a lot more and you're not eating as much, you lose weight, or what animal you are. So if polar bears are moving a lot more, how much weight are they going to lose? Or what kind of are they burning? How much energy do they need? Things we can't find out from wild polar bears. We really need to work with amazing zoos and these wonderful zoo bears that are, have different lives, but really important lives, and polar bears. So we do work with some different zoos to find out cool things about polar bears. And we know how well polar bears hear is because of zoo study. And we can also find out things about how they move and how they have different hormones in their body and kind of the base levels of stuff. So that's really cool in that way. And then I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about this, because we're getting a lot of questions about this guy. And I think it's kind of a neat story. So this is called people call it a Pizzly bear, and it's kind of a funny looking bear. So way up in the high Canadian North, there were a few growler bears spotted over the last few years. And now at first what they were, so you can see from a distance, you might think that's a polar bear, but when you get closer, it's got dark circles around its eyes, and it's kind of got a dark stripe down its back. And you can't really see it here, but its feet are pretty funny looking. They don't really look like a grizzly bear's feet, but they don't really look like a polar bear's feet. And its nose is kind of a mixture. So sometimes have an upturned nose kind of, and polar bears have more of a sloped down nose, and this goofy. So anyway, we were wondering what is going on with these growler bears. So a polar bear mated, but we didn't know why or if this was happening a lot only because of the totes. So we got samples from the Growler Bears, and we were able to find out kind of who was mating with who. And we found out that there was one female polar bear. She'd mated with a couple grizzly bears, and they had had cubs, and then those cubs had more cubs, and we had Growler Bears. But we don't see many more now. Occasionally in the future, but it looks like most of the Growler Bears are gone right now. But it's just a really cool example of what can be going on in the Arctic that we don't know about, and science helps us understand that. So only by analyzing and asking questions and answering them in a really scientific way do we finally find out what's going on. And it's so cool to be able to do that. A little bit about what I do up here. So this I mentioned earlier is a Tundra Buggy. So usually I'm on a Tundra Buggy, and you can see that the wheels are about 5 feet taller than a lot of you, and it's almost taller than me. And you can see the polar bear on its all fours is also about 5 feet tall, or a little less. This one's a bit smaller than some of the others. And we, at this time of year, as like I mentioned before, the polar bears are hanging out, come in, they haven't eaten a good meal for a long time. This polar bear is eating a little, they get kind of hungry, so they do munch on little snacks, even though it doesn't really fill them up very well. So we can roll around on these buggies really safe and high up from polar bears. And so the bears are safe and the humans are safe, and we can watch polar bears all day. And it's really neat to be able to be out there. And then we can put live cams on, and I'm going to try to show you the live camera in a minute. But the Tundra Buggies are pretty neat. So when polar bears come on land, they don't eat for quite a while. They can go eating pretty normally. And then pregnant females right now, so pregnant females came off the ice in the spring, or the summer, sorry. They came off the ice probably in July of this year, and they went into their dens. So they'll be in their dens right now, and they'll give birth in about a month or so. And then they're going to nurse their cubs in those dens, and then they'll leave with the cubs and go back to the sea ice in about March. And so if you do the math, go about 8 months without eating any food. Can you imagine not eating for 8 months? We don't even like skipping dinner here. So that is a long time for polar bears to go. So that's pretty crazy. These are really, really amazing things we sometimes see in Churchill. I just want to show you kind of a fun thing. So this is called Sparring. And Churchill is one of the only places in the world that we can see this normally. And usually it's when the temperatures have cooled down, it's before the sea ice is back, and sometimes we see male bears playing. And so this is just play fighting right now. They're kind of sizing each other up. They're whacking each other, but they're not really hurting each other usually very much. Usually if one of them gets a little scratch, they back off because they're just trying to have fun. You can see them biting each other. So we wouldn't want to play wrestle with the polar bear because they're rougher than we are. But you can see that they're having a good time. And so we sometimes do see this out here. Now in the spring, polar bears fight for real. Polar bears will fight over females in the spring when it's mating season. Polar males are about twice as big as polar bear females, and we dimorphic, and that means 2 sizes. So polar bears are dimorphic, with the males being very, very big and the females also being big, but about half the size of males. This is always neat when we see this up in Churchill, even though I haven't really seen this so far this year. An older clip. There we go. So I just want to talk to you care about the polar bear. So of course the polar bear is so cool. We want to keep the polar bear forever just because it is awesome. But there's so much more that goes into protecting the polar bear. The Arctic ecosystem is just amazing. It is such a neat place. It really grows the whole thing, which you don't really think of sometimes. So sea ice isn't just like regular ice. You can think of it kind of like almost an forest. Sea ice is the soil, and it grows the algae, the green stuff, which feeds the little creatures, which feeds the slightly bigger creatures, and eventually feeds the fish and the seals and the polar bear and the people. So there's also people in the Arctic that depend on the food chain. And yeah, all these little creatures are in and under the sea ice. It is so neat. So it's really important that we have sea ice up here and that we protect it so the polar bear can keep eating, but so this whole food continue to happen. And I think a lot of you know that sea ice is declining. So this is just a graph showing sea ice going down over time. And so we know that we are losing sea ice, but we know that we can do something about it. And another reason that sea ice matters is it's like our air conditioner. So wherever you guys are in the world right now today, even if you're nowhere near the Arctic actually does affect you. Sea ice reflects heat away from the Earth, which helps cool the entire planet. So that's pretty neat. The Arctic ice isn't only helping the polar bear, it's helping all of us. Even if you live down in Ecuador or something, the sea ice is good for you to have there. So it protects the Earth from too much heat, and it helps polar bears. Okay, so what is going on with the polar bear situation right now? So right now, there are about 20 to 26,000 polar bears across the world, and it's really hard to get a good guess because there's so many places that are really hard to study for polar bears. And what's happening is that as we're burning fossil fuels like coal and oil and gas for things like transportation or heating our homes, we add what we call carbon emissions to the atmosphere. And in regular amounts, emissions are okay because they act like a heat-trapping blanket and they can keep us nice and warm. But when we add too many fossil fuels, so if we're burning fossil fuels and adding rampant amounts, we thicken our heat-trapping blanket. And I'm sure all of you have had an experience where you had too many blankets on top of you, or maybe too many layers of coats in the winter or something, and you just get too warm when you're trapping too much heat. And I'm sure you also know from being in the summer, maybe you've had a slushy drink outside in the summer and then all of a sudden it's melted. Of course, sea ice melts when it gets warm. And as sea ice melts, polar bears, like I mentioned, they don't get to eat as much food. They can't catch as many seals. So if we do nothing to help polar bears, then we're going to go from a worldwide population of polar bears from about this much to about this much. So we could lose almost 2/3 of polar bears in the next 100 years or so. But we want to make sure that doesn't happen, and we can do that. So every single person watching today and everyone that we talk to has the ability to help polar bears, no matter how old you are, live. Really worth saving because protecting polar bears means protecting people. If we protect sea ice, it's good for the whole planet. And so anything you can do to reduce helps. So that means that we can do things like we can drive less and we can walk more and bike more. We can reduce, reuse, recycle and all that stuff, but it's really helpful if we do things more at a community level, like in our cities. And so maybe your school has a recycling program, or maybe a carpool program, or maybe admits to taking the bus. And maybe you could talk to your parents about what they can do. So if your parents are voting for your mayor or your other officials that care about the environment, that's a really good thing. If you're old enough, you can vote for people that make those decisions, or maybe you become a person that makes those decisions. So when you grow up, whatever you want, a business owner or a politician or a biologist or a bike messenger, anything you want to do, you can make this just good for the planet, and anything that is good for the planet is good for you and your family. So that's a really neat thing about polar bears. So I'm going to take questions in a minute, but I'm going to also try to do a live camera feed. So right now, I think it's been so blizzardy in Churchill. So this is right now, we've got all these cameras out around the tundra, but it's really blowy today out there, so it's blowing a lot of snow. And when it blows so much, polar bears tend to just kind of make a little daybed and hunker down. And so they're really hard to see. You can kind of see that might be a polar bear sleeping in the snow right there, but it's hard to tell when the conditions are so bad. But this is a website called explore.org. You can get your teacher or parents' help. And they have the polar bear cams running, and you can watch live polar bears when they are around. And unfortunately, today is one of those days. Sometimes when it's not so stormy, you can see moms and cubs, and maybe you can see Sparring, and you can see us wandering around on the Tundra Buggy. And there's all these different cams at the bottom that you can click through. So unfortunately, I think all the polar bears might be sleeping in the storm right now, but I'll keep an eye on them, and I'll show you if we can. Otherwise, we can post a link for you somewhere maybe. Joe, if it works for you or your class, I'm happy to take questions or keep talking about anything.
I think we should take some questions, meet some of the classrooms.
Totally.
All right. Well, thank you, Elisa, for sharing that with us. Pretty lucky getting to spend a good portion of time with the amazing animals that polar bears are. So that's pretty awesome. And obviously, thanks for the work you do, the conservation work that you do, and the work you do hanging out with students like this, and sharing with them what's happening and what they can possibly do. So thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. It's super fun.
All right, so we've got a great group of classrooms joining us on camera, and then there's also some watching via YouTube. So just a reminder to anybody watching live on YouTube, you can use the YouTube live chat sidebar and let us know who you are and where you're from, and even fire off a question or two. So just want to give a shout out to Mrs. Theo's grade 5 class in Waterloo, Ontario. They said hi over the live chat, and it looks like they have a couple of questions that we'll get to as we go through. So let's meet our first group. Let's jump over and turn on the microphone for Mrs. Voorberg's grade 4 class in Oakville, Ontario in Canada. How's everyone doing today? Good. All right, if you guys have a question, let's start with one question from each class and then I'll come back around. So if you guys want to start us off.
How many babies can a polar bear have?
How many babies can a polar bear have? Yeah, so one female usually has about 1 to 3 babies at a time, usually about 1 or 2. And every female usually has babies every 3 years. So she'll have babies 1 year, say she has 2, and then the first year of the year when they're little, and then the next year when they're over a year old, they're called yearlings. And then when they're about 2.5, they get weaned by mom, and mom will go try to find another mate to have another litter of babies. So usually we see moms with 1 or 2 cubs at a time.
All right, so we will swing through each classroom once, just so you're not waiting too long, and then I'll call classrooms up to the camera again if they have extra questions. But online, we're also joined by Mrs. Beckett's class in Paris, Ontario. They say hey, but I'll grab a question from Mrs. Theo's grade 5s. They're wondering, let's see, let's go with this one. So how big can a polar bear get? So height and weight.
Yeah, so the big males can get really, really big. I think the record ever male was about 2,100 pounds, which is like, it's so big, huge. But usually we see male bears that are about 1,400 pounds. So that's probably more than maybe 14 of you, maybe over half your classroom worth. And then when they're on their hind legs, they can be just over 10 feet tall. So that means they can dunk a basketball. And then if they're standing on all 4s, they can be about 5 feet tall. So it would be like up to here on me. So polar bears get really, really big.
All right. Great questions. Keep them coming in online. Let's go over to Mrs. Boss's class. I'll turn your microphone on. How's everyone doing? All right. So they are joining us from St. Mary's in Canada, grade 5 students. Go ahead with the question.
Okay. How long can a full-grown polar bear swim for?
Oh, really good question. How long can a polar bear swim for? Yeah, we have been able to track polar bears that have swam for a very long time. And I just did some research last year that showed that one female polar bear, she swam for over 9 days straight and went over 400 kilometers. So I don't know, maybe your teacher can show you on a map later how far 400 kilometers would be from you guys, but it's a really long way. And I can hardly swim for half an hour straight, let alone 9 days. So they can really swim a long distance if they have to. But it takes a lot of energy. So they tend to lose a lot of weight when they swim that long. It's not very healthy.
That's incredible. That is an endurance swim for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's jump over to British Columbia. We have a grade 2-3 class joining us from West Kelowna in British Columbia with Mr. Warkoch. And go ahead with your question.
How old can a polar bear get?
That's right.
Great. Yeah, so in the wild, female polar bears live until their maybe mid-20s or late 20s, and live into their maybe late teens or early 20s. So males don't live as long because they fight a lot more, and fighting's really hard on their bodies. But when we have a polar bear in a zoo, it can live a lot longer because they're a little more pampered. And so the record longest living polar bear ever was 42 years old, and she lived in Winnipeg. Might be muted.
Probably would be easier to hear me if I wasn't muted. Great question. Let's slide over online. So Mrs. Beckett's class is wondering a little bit about polar bear sleeping habits. So the question that came in is, do they sleep in trees, or ever sleep in trees? But maybe you can tell us a little bit about their sleeping habits.
Sure. So polar bears don't sleep in trees, don't have claws that are very well suited for climbing, and their bodies aren't really well suited for being in trees. But what polar bears do like to do is dig a little bed in the snow or ice, or if they're on land, they'll dig a little bed in sand or in the peat. We call it a day bed, and they just kind of make a nice little polar bear hole. And they'll nap there. And then if a blizzard comes in, so like right now, what a lot of them have likely done is they dig a little bed and they lay in it and they just let the snow cover them like a big snow blanket. And we see them do that all the time. And sometimes they startle us because we don't know a polar bear's there. It's covered in snow. And then they pop their head up and we didn't even know there was a bear there. So bears do like to sleep. At this time of year when they're conserving their energy, when they haven't eaten, they can sleep, almost. So they will sleep a lot. But when they're out hunting, we still don't really know how much they sleep in the winter, but we do assume it's, a good amount. It's dark a lot in the dark, but we assume that they make day beds out on the ice too, to have need one.
All right. Let's jump over to Hutchinson, Kansas now with Mrs. Ediger. They are joining us. They are grade 4 students at Grabber Elementary. So go ahead with the question.
Have you always been interested in polar bears?
What a nice question. Have I always been interested in polar bears? I liked a lot of animals, but I never specifically knew much about polar bears. When I started going to school after high school, I actually studied mice and toads for years. I really liked mice and toads, and they're obviously a lot smaller, fun. And then I just kind of accidentally met someone who studied polar bears, and I thought that that would be really cool. So once I started studying polar bears, I absolutely fell in love. They're so neat, and the landscape they live in is amazing. And so I've been studying polar bears now for over 7 years, and I really enjoy it, and I love them so much. But no, I wasn't always looking to be a polar bear researcher, but I'm really glad that it worked out that way.
All right, great question. We're glad it worked out that way too. Let's turn on Mrs. Golchinski's microphone. So they are joining us. Let's see, where's their listing? There it is. So grade 3 is joining us from Dundee, Florida. Go ahead with your question.
What do you still have to research about polar bears?
What do we still have to research about polar bears? Oh my gosh, so many of you want to be a polar bear researcher. There are so many things we can still learn about them. We still don't know a lot about where they move. So up until last year, so for decades, so way longer than you guys have been alive, we've only been tracking female polar bears because males can't wear collars. So just now we're finally tracking males and trying to figure out where males are going. We also don't know a lot about their mating habits in dens when they give birth. We don't know a lot about their prey. It's really hard to study seals. And so it would be so cool if we could learn a lot more about seals and where the seals are. And there's actually many populations beginning of the talk there. We don't know a lot about a lot of the polar bear populations, the ones in Russia or the ones way up in the high Arctic. We have no idea how many polar bears there are. Don't know if their genetics are different really, or if I don't know if they have different habits. There's so much still to learn about polar bears. And how they're going to be impacted by losing sea ice. Of questions. We can always keep asking questions. And I'm sure you guys have a lot of brand new questions too that you could answer for polar bears. You are scientists.
All right, so let's grab another question from online. We have a class wondering about their fur. Does it feel like a dog's fur, or is it maybe more waterproof?
That's a really neat question. So, it does kind of feel like a dog's fur. got 2 layers of fur. So one next to the skin is really thick and kind of downy. It's like a sweater. And then they have another longer layer, one that we see over top. And that's kind of like their raincoat. So it is a bit more waterproof. But you know, their hair is actually hollow and it's colorless. So they'll have warm air next to their body. And yeah, the colorless makes them look white to us, even though they're really clear. So their fur is so cool and it keeps them nice and warm. But when they're swimming, it's actually their body fat that keeps them warmer. Their fur isn't as effective if they're totally drenched. But it's really good in the Arctic icy coldness. So yeah, they've got super great fur. And they kind of do smell like a wet dog too, really. I think they do when they've been kind of getting wet there. Yeah, very similar. They're not soft. Even the cubs, they might look soft, but they're not very soft.
All right, great question. Just a reminder to classrooms who are watching online or classrooms who are watching live with us, do take some pictures and then share them over Twitter. We always love to see classrooms in action and enjoying Hangouts. Our final class joining us online is Mrs. Gilpins, and they are grade 2, joining us from Zachary, and I think that's Louisiana, but you can confirm that for me. Your microphone's on. Go ahead with the question.
Cool.
Oops, I lied. Your microphone's not on. It is now.
How thick is the sea ice?
How big is the sea ice?
How thick is the sea ice?
Good question. Okay, so this is so interesting because the sea ice varies, which means it changes in thickness all across the Arctic. So in some places up really in the high Arctic, it's really, really thick. It can be meters thick or many feet thick. And then in some places like in Hudson Bay in the next month or so, it's just going to be thin. It's only going to be a couple inches thick. And polar bears can actually walk on pretty thin sea size because actually I have a foot here. So their feet are really, really big. So this is just 1 forefoot. And if you imagine a really fat polar bear, if they're spreading their weight over really big feet, then there's not as much weight right on the sea ice. And sea ice is salty and it makes it kind of bendy. So polar bears can walk on pretty thin ice. But yeah, it depends on where they are in the world, how thick the ice is. And we do know that the ice is thinning up more. So where it used to be really thick, it is getting thinner. So that is going to have impacts on polar bears too that we need to understand better. So yeah, great question. Lots of different types of sea ice out there.
All right, so great. We visited all our classrooms for one round. What I'll do now is if there are questions from the classrooms, if you want to send someone up right to the camera, that'll be my signal that your classroom has a question. But while we wait for that, I've got a grade 5 class online wondering about predators of polar bears.
Yeah, so polar bears don't have any predators. In fact, their only real predator is people and other polar bears. So we don't see a lot of cannibalism, but there is some. So occasionally a polar bear will eat another polar bear. But other than that, polar bears are at the top of the food chain. They don't have to worry about much else.
All right. Well, at least I hope you have a few more minutes because I see lots of faces back up at the camera.
Totally.
So let's go. Let's start off in British Columbia. And let me turn your microphone on. Go ahead with your question.
Oh,
can you come a little closer? It's a little quiet.
So she wants to know, how did the grizzly bear and the polar bear get together? Why was the grizzly bear in the Arctic?
Oh, yeah. Why was that grizzly bear up there? Great question. So grizzly bears, actually, there are some of them that live way up north, and we're not really sure. This is, again, these things happen. We don't see it. Our best guess is that a couple grizzly bears maybe just, I don't know, decided to go for a stroll one day and kind of went out to this. A female polar bear happened to be closer to land than usual, and they happened to overlap. Maybe they smelled each other in the air. So yeah, we do see some grizzly bears way up north, but that was an unusual one. We don't really know why those two bears got in contact with each other. So yeah, great question, and another thing that maybe we'll learn more about in the future.
All right, back to Mrs. Voorberg's class. Let me turn your microphone on.
Why can't male polar bears wear collars?
Yeah, why can't the males wear a collar? So male polar bears kind of have pylon-shaped heads. So they have a really thick neck, and then their skull is still big, but it's thinner compared to their neck. So their pylon, it's like a cone. And so if we put a collar on, the bear can really easily take it off. And females have also a big head, but a more slender neck. It's a little nicer. And they're better able to wear this collar. And they can still pull it off if they want to, but it's not quite as easy to slip it off. And so males just were never able to. Now what we do is we give the males a GPS ear tag. So they get a small one, and it doesn't last as long, but they can actually just wear one in their ear. So it's gotten much better. But yeah, males just have funny shaped heads and neck.
All right. Mrs. Ediger, I think I see someone in your classroom. Your microphone's on.
What do polar bears love to eat?
What do the polar bears love to eat?
Yes.
Yeah. So polar bears' very, very favorite food is seal. And there's two main types of seals that they eat. There's a ringed seal, and those are a little smaller. They can be like 100 pounds. And then we have a bearded seal, and those are super fat, and they can be like 400 pounds. So that's what polar bears love to eat most of. Bears has a lot of food, then it'll just eat the fat. It won't even eat the meat or anything. It just wants to steal fat. My favorite food.
So I remember from our last hangout, you told us how much a polar bear could eat in one setting. Can you tell the students how much they can eat?
Yeah. Bears can eat a ton of food at once. They have to, because they'll go a long time without eating. And then when they do have food, they have to eat so much at one time. So they can eat like 100 pounds in one sitting if they have to. And it's basically the only limitation how big their stomach is. So they will eat and eat and eat and eat, and they'll stay with this till they've consumed the whole thing. So they eat like tens of thousands of calories in one sitting, which for us, our daily limit is supposed to be like 2,000 a day for humans. But polar bears will just blow right by that limit and eat as much as they possibly can.
That's pretty amazing. Those polar bears would gain more weight than some of the students watching in one sitting.
Yeah, they can gain a few hundred pounds in a short, a few months. It's easy. Yeah.
All right, let's visit Mrs. Gilpin's class again. I see someone waiting up at the camera. Go ahead.
Are polar bears endangered?
Really good question. Are polar bears endangered? So endangered is a word that we use it's a lead, so it means a very specific thing. We actually call polar bears threatened, which is just below endangered. So that means that polar bears are threatened with the loss of sea ice. We know that things are not going to be good for polar bears if we continue to lose sea ice, but we don't consider them endangered yet because there's still enough polar bears out there right now. But we're worried about their future. So we don't ever want them to be endangered. We want them to, be doing better even. But yeah, we do consider them threatened at the moment.
All right, and I see someone up at Mrs. Boss's camera. Okay, microphone's on.
How cold does it have to be for a polar bear to live there?
Oh. And so, it's interesting because in a lot of the polar bears range, it's cold all year round. It is always like -0 or below. But here in places like Canada, so in Manitoba and Ontario and Quebec, when polar bears come over, it can actually be kind of warm. So here, I know in Churchill in the summer, it can be in Celsius, it can be, +25 pretty easily Celsius. And polar bears are here. They don't move a lot because they overheat very quickly when it's that warm. But they definitely, it seems like when it's below 0, they seem to kind of perk up and be happier bears when it's really cold outside. But they do sometimes live in places that occasionally get kind of warm in the summer. They'll go out on the sea ice as soon as it gets cold.
All right, and then Mrs. Golchinski's class in Florida. Is that somebody up at the camera?
Yes.
Excellent.
How thick does the sea ice need to be for a polar bear to walk on it?
The That's a good question. So it depends on how big the polar bear is, and it would depend on the kind of sea ice. But you know, a couple inches or even slightly thinner if the polar bear is not a huge polar bear and it's spreading its weight out. But really, they can walk on pretty thin ice. It doesn't have to be super thick before they'll try. And if it is a little thin, we call it, the polar bears kind of do this thing we call a starfish. And they can even like lay on their bellies with all their legs out and shuffle along like this to get across the sea ice. And that's always pretty funny to watch.
All right, and maybe we'll grab 2 more questions because I see 2 more students right up at the camera. So let's do that. So Mrs. Gilpin, one more time. I see someone there waiting.
Hey, right.
How do you tag a polar bear?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
I think were you asking how do you tag a polar bear?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So very important question that scientists have to think about all the time. So we tag a polar bear very safely. And that means that it has to be tranquilized or sleeping while we do that. So when we're going to go research polar bears, we go up in a helicopter and we look for polar bears on the ground around us. And then when we find one, we can go low with the helicopter and we can dart it with a small dart that has a medicine in it that puts the bear to sleep for about an hour. And once the bear is sleeping, then we'll get on the ground and we'll go lay the bear nice and comfortably, and then we'll measure it. And then there's like, I don't know if anyone's ever had their ear pierced, but we have like a little ear punch and we just punch the tag through it. And every tag has an individual number on it. So polar bears don't have numbers. And that's how we track the polar bear throughout its life. So if we ever see that bear again, already tag and we know exactly who that bear is, and we can track it over its life history. So that's how we learn about them over time.
All right, and one more visit to Mrs. Vorberg's class. Your microphone's on.
Are polar bears smart?
Are they smart? Yeah. Polar bears are so smart. They are really tricky, actually. And people that take care of them in zoos have to be really careful because polar bears will figure things out. So if you think about how smart a polar bear has to be to find seals and stay healthy and alive in a crazy sea ice that's really barren, they're really curious and they can figure out how to get food kind of creatively. And so, yeah, we always see them figuring things out on the tundra, whether that's buggies or digging through things, or in zoos, they're solving problems and they can learn things all the time. They can be trained to do all sorts of things, which means that they want to learn these new ways to do things and get rewarded. So we think bears generally are very smart and polar bears are very, very smart that way. All
right. Well, Elisa, once again, thank you so much for hanging out with us up in Churchill on what I'm sure is a cold and windy day. I think here in Southern Ontario, we're expecting our first little bit of kind of rainy snow tonight. So not quite what you're having, but I think it's coming down here too.
Yeah, it might be part of the same weather. Thanks to me.
All right. Well, can you just remind us one more time what the website is? Because I'm sure over the next few weeks, the classrooms would love to kind of keep an eye on those live cameras.
And I'll maybe just try to share it real quick again. So the website is explore.org. And so even if you Googled polar bear cam, you might be able to find it. And yeah, you can go online and check out all these different cams. And they've got other animals too, but of course the polar bear cam is our very favorite one. So yeah, check out any new polar bears out there. It looks like there's a sleeping polar bear there in the distance. So yeah, it'd be great if you guys tuned in.
All right. There we go. So explore.org. Check that out, classrooms. And yeah, maybe over the next little while, you get to see some polar bears in action. Awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much, boys and girls. As always, your questions are awesome, and we love having you join in. Just before we sign off, of course, we'll turn the microphones on and give you a chance to be nice and loud and say goodbye and thank you. But once again, have fun in Churchill and out in the buggies when the weather clears. And we look forward to our next connection.
Thanks, everyone. It was great chatting with you today.
All right, let's go with the microphone. So microphones are coming on. Everybody nice and loud. Thank you. All right. Well, you guys are definitely professionals at that. Thank you so much, as always. And I hope everybody has a great day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Great.